Smoke from the grill still hung in the air when my sister raised her glass and called me the man with the most free time, just loud enough for the whole ballroom to hear. Callan Rinn, 52, former engineer, steadying my father's cool pocket watch in my hand while the air conditioning hummed, cold against my neck. Ever had a moment where one jab changed how everyone looked at you? The air tasted faintly of salt and smoke as the sun lowered itself toward the Atlantic, painting the manicured lawn of Celine's rented cliffside villa in streaks of orange and gold. Jazz hummed from a Bluetooth speaker near the grill, mingling with the hum of conversation and the occasional clink of wine glasses. I stood near the edge of the patio, just far enough from the clusters of cousins and business acquaintances to breathe, turning my father's old pocket watch in my palm. Its cool metal steadied me, the glass face catching the fading light in a quiet flash. That watch had been wound and unwound by hands far steadier than mine, on mornings colder than this, in places far lonelier than a Rhode Island villa full of family. Celine's voice, smooth and practiced for a crowd, cut through the warm chatter behind me. At least Callan doesn't have to worry about vacation days he's got nowhere to work. She didn't laugh at her own line, but the pause after told everyone it was safe to do so. A ripple of chuckles circled the group, Howard's business friends smiling without quite meeting my eye, and a cousin elbowed another like they were sharing in some harmless joke. I didn't turn around, didn't give them my face to read. I let my thumb trace the grooves in the watch's case, the familiar etching almost worn smooth from years of touch, and I looked out at the water, where the horizon met the last haze of daylight. Howard, tall and immaculate, stood just behind Celine, one hand resting in his pocket, while the other held a glass of wine. He kept glancing at his phone, his attention clearly divided between the performance his fiancée was giving and whatever negotiation or ticker update kept buzzing on his screen. I wondered if I was even a blip on his radar beyond being the butt of her little jab. Marius sat off to the side, his weathered hands folded over his cane, eyes drifting from one face to the next like he was reading a manual on each of us. The old man hadn't said a word since the grill was lit, but I could feel his gaze from across the yard, the way he could tell the difference between a man's pride being bruised and his anger boiling over. I slipped the watch into my pocket, letting its weight rest there like a silent anchor, and crossed to the drinks table. The jazz track shifted to something softer, the saxophone stretching notes over the hum of conversation. I poured myself a club soda, the fizz loud in the evening quiet, and studied the sunset instead of the people. The sea air brought with it the faint tang of charcoal from the grill, and I breathed it in as if the scent could drown out the echo of my sister's voice, still hanging in the air. The phone in my pocket buzzed a soft, insistent vibration that felt oddly comforting. I set down the glass and pulled the phone out, shielding the screen from view with my hand. A name I hadn't seen outside of old deployment rosters lit up the display, Rowan, one of my pilots from the reserve, a man whose instincts were as steady as his landings. "Heard about the big wedding." "You good?" The corner of my mouth lifted despite myself. A smile, half amusement, half relief. Even out here, surrounded by moneyed laughter and subtle digs, there was someone who still used my title without irony, someone who knew me for more than Celine's casual narrative. I thumbed out a reply, pausing as I watched the waves swell and collapse beneath the last stripes of sun. "Still got one person who salutes me." I muttered the words barely escaping before they were swallowed by the breeze. The wind carried the faint sounds of the party behind me. Celine's laugh pitched just high enough to carry Howard murmuring to a friend about quarterly reports, the soft clinking of ice against glass. None of it touched me out on the patio, not really. I typed carefully, my fingers steady now. Might need a favor tomorrow. Are you still flying that Gulfstream? As I hit send, I slipped the phone back into my pocket beside the watch, the two weights resting together like old allies. The horizon dimmed another shade, the first star appearing above the darkening water, and I let out a slow breath. Behind me, the laughter swelled again over some new line, but I didn't bother to catch it. The night smelled of salt smoke and something almost like freedom, and for the first time all evening, I felt a small private anticipation stir beneath the surface calm. Rain peppered the windows of my cedar cabin, a gentle percussion against the steady slapping of waves on the rocks below. The place was small and creaky, the kind of home where the floorboards groan under your steps and the fridge hums like an old generator through the night. I'd chosen it for its solitude, not its comfort, but lately the silence pressed heavier than the damp air that seeped in when the wind shifted off the bay. The chirp of my phone startled me, breaking the quiet in a way that felt louder than it was. Another late payment notice glared up from the screen. The cabin, already sparse, felt like it emptied even further around me. I set the phone down face first on the counter and wrapped my hands around a chipped mug of coffee, the bitter brew long since gone cold. Across from me, the photo of my mother sat framed beside a folded letter she'd written years ago, the handwriting neat and precise, the kind she used on birthday cards and grocery lists. Her smile in that photo had a softness to it, the kind that could still stop me mid-thought even now. I owed it to her memory to keep my composure, but it was getting harder each day. A ping from my laptop drew me to the desk in the corner. I clicked it open, already knowing what I'd find. Contract termination, effective immediately. No apology, no explanation beyond restructuring. The body of the email was all clipped sentences and legal phrases, a perfect display of how little 20 years of my work seemed to matter to the people who had once depended on me to keep their operations running. I read it twice, not because I needed to, but because I couldn't seem to close it. My finger hovered over the trackpad until the screen dimmed on its own. On the edge of the desk sat a small stack of envelopes I'd been avoiding. I reached for the top one, an overdue invoice from the assisted living facility where my mother had spent her last months. I traced the embossed name of the center with my thumb before tucking the paper neatly back into its envelope and sealing it, a reflex I'd developed after too many of these reminders. Each one carried the same sharp tug of responsibility and failure, a dual weight I couldn't shrug off. Behind me, the kettle whistled faintly as Marius moved around the kitchen. He never asked questions about the notices or the way I stared too long at blank screens. Instead, he poured water into a teapot, the soft clink of the teaspoon, stirring blending with the sound of rain outside. A moment later, his hand, warm rough from years of handling tools and ropes, settled gently on my shoulder. He didn't speak, didn't need to. The weight of his hand was its own reassurance, a quiet reminder that someone still believed I could find my footing again. The radio, perpetually tuned to some low-volume news station, crackled to life on the windowsill. A calm voice announced another airline merger, a deal that would streamline operations and improve shareholder value. I let out a breath that felt halfway between a sigh and a laugh, the kind you make when the joke's on you. "Guess they found newer wings?" I murmured, my voice barely audible over the patter of rain and static. I reached over to the desk, where my father's pocket watch lay ticking in patient defiance of the gloom. I picked it up, feeling the smoothness of its case against my skin, the faint familiar hum of its mechanism. It was one of the few constants left reliable, unassuming, unbroken. The rain eased for a moment, leaving only the soft ticking to fill the room. I held the watch closer, stared at its steady hands, and whispered into the dim cabin, "Not done yet." The words felt heavier than the room, like a promise. I wasn't ready to break, even if I didn't yet know how I'd keep it. The morning air was heavy with the smell of salt and wet stone, the kind of damp that clung to the railings and seeped into your sleeves if you stood still too long. Mist curled along the balcony, rising from the Atlantic below, in pale ribbons that softened the sharp edges of the cliffs. I leaned against the wooden railing of Celine's villa, a chipped mug of coffee in one hand, my other resting on the table beside the repaired chain of my father's pocket watch. Its links gleamed faintly in the weak dawn light, polished but still showing the wear of decades, like an heirloom that had earned its place rather than been hidden away for show. Marius eased himself into the chair opposite me, the cane he used resting against the table. He slid the watch chain toward me with his fingertips, his expression as neutral as ever, but his eyes sharper than the fog around us. "Your father used to say," he began, his voice slow, "deliberate rank isn't about who signs the checks. It's about who people trust to lead when it's dark and loud." He let the words hang there as steady and unyielding as the tide. I traced the chain with my thumb, the coolness grounding me. "Feels like I lost both," I said with a small chuckle that didn't quite reach my eyes. The coffee steamed between us, its heat a faint contrast to the mist pressing in around the balcony. The faint thrum of something far above, maybe a training jet on maneuvers, slipped into the space between our words, distant and almost imagined. I tilted my head toward the sound, a half-smile tugging at my mouth. "They still make that sound." At least I murmured my tone, halfway between nostalgia and resolve. I pulled out my phone and opened a message thread that hadn't seen activity in months. My fingers hovered for a moment before I typed, "Confirm arrival for tomorrow's ceremony." The text glowed on the screen, simple and understated the way I preferred to handle most things. I didn't mention the insult at the barbecue, or the way Celine's friends had smirked like they knew my worth better than I did. This wasn't about revenge, not entirely. It was about remembering that I hadn't been stripped of everything, that there were still corners of my life where my name and effort meant something. The mug trembled slightly in my left hand as I lifted it, the tremor so subtle that most wouldn't notice, but I did. The nerves were there, crawling just beneath the calm exterior I'd spent years crafting. I took a slow sip of the coffee, the bitterness settling my stomach as much as the heat steadied my grip. Across from me, Marius watched without comment, his eyes as patient as the rolling fog. He knew better than to name the nerves out loud. He also knew that acknowledgement wasn't always necessary for something to be real. The phone buzzed against the table, a short, firm vibration. I set down the mug and glanced at the screen. A single word reply, affirmative. No flourish, no questions, just certainty. I let the corner of my mouth curl into the faintest grin. That was all I needed. Sliding the watch into my pocket, I felt its weight settle against me like a quiet assurance. I rose from the chair, the mist parting slightly as a breeze drifted in off the sea, carrying with it the scent of brine and distant kelp. "One more mission," I said softly, not to Marius, not even to myself so much as to the morning air that felt like it was holding its breath. The words didn't carry far, but they didn't need to. The day ahead would be loud enough. The lights in the Cliffside Hotel's ballroom hummed with a low, steady buzz, like the sound of distant electricity in a quiet room. Crystal glasses clinked softly from the main hall beyond the closed doors, laughter drifting in muffled bursts as Celine's rehearsal dinner rolled along. I stayed near the edge of the space away from the circle of her friends and Howard's polished colleagues, content to sip water and keep my head low. The evening smelled faintly of citrus polish on the mahogany floors, and the floral centerpieces lining the tables, clean, elegant, and slightly artificial, much like the atmosphere Celine liked to curate. The sound of a chair scraping caught my attention, just a heartbeat before Celine's hand closed around the strap of my bag. She yanked it off the seat, letting it swing against her leg as she looked down at me with that sweet, clipped smile she used when she wanted everyone to believe her words were harmless. The bag slipped the clasp, giving way, and the pocket watch tumbled free. It hit the tile with a crisp, echoing crack that made even the whispering cousins flinch. The glass face spiderwebbed instantly before a sharp shard detached and skittered across the floor, catching the glow of the chandelier above as it came to rest. Celine tilted her head, her voice soft enough to sound polite, but pointed enough to cut. Still clinging to relics, brother. Maybe time to buy something new. She crouched to retrieve the strap of my bag, but didn't bother to glance at the watch. Her eyes flickered with something, maybe guilt, maybe satisfaction, before the practiced smirk returned. I knelt slowly, knees bending, until the faint pop of an old joint reminded me I wasn't as agile as I once was. My fingers brushed the shard first, and the edge bit into my skin with an almost surgical precision. A line of red welled up bright against the cool white tile. I gathered the broken pieces carefully, the soft whisper of my sleeve brushing the floor as I moved, wrapping the larger fragments in a napkin I'd snagged from the table. There was no flare of anger, no barked words, only the faint sting of the cut and the muted hum of the lights overhead, their sound filling the silence I chose to leave. The phone in my jacket pocket buzzed once. I shifted my weight, set the wrapped fragments on the table, and retrieved it. A short message lit the screen. Runway cleared for 1500 tomorrow. Ready when you are. The words were direct, clean, carrying none of the pettiness or ceremony that floated in this room. For a moment, the faint ache in my finger dulled as something sharper took hold, not vengeance, but focus. I pressed the napkin against the cut, feeling the fabric grow warm beneath my fingertips. My eyes narrowed slightly, not at Celine, not at the cousins watching from across the room, but at the thought of what tomorrow would bring. My reflection caught briefly in the sliver of mirrored wall behind the bar, calm, unremarkable, a man collecting broken glass rather than making a scene. That was fine. Sliding the remains of the watch into my pocket, I tightened my grip around the wrapped fragments and straightened. It'll shine again. I whispered the words meant for the quiet space around me more than anyone else. The chandelier's light caught the napkin as I tucked it away, a faint glow on the white cloth, as I turned toward the hallway. The laughter from the main hall rose in another wave, but it felt distant, almost hollow, as I stepped away, the soft hum of the ballroom lights trailing behind me like a quiet drum beat for what came next. Chandeliers bathed the Cliffside Hotel's grand ballroom in a soft, golden light that gleamed off the crystal and glass, giving every polished surface a warm glow. Beyond the towering windows, the Atlantic stretched out in rolling shades of blue and silver, calm and endless, the kind of view people paid far too much for, but rarely stopped to appreciate. The air inside buzzed with conversation, punctuated by the delicate chime of cutlery and the murmur of polite laughter. Celine stood near the head table champagne flute, lifted just high enough to catch the chandelier's light. her smile poised for the crowd. "And here's my brother," she said, her tone airy, her posture loose, in a way that was meant to suggest affection, but leaned a shade too close to performance. "The man with the most free time at this wedding." The line floated for a beat. Then the ripple came a polite, subdued laughter that traveled across the room like a wave designed not to spill anyone's drink. A few glances darted my way, the sort of cursory looks people use when they're trying to gauge if the target of the joke will take it in stride or not. I let the faintest smile touch my lips, not enough to fuel their comfort, but not sharp enough to cut. My hand rested in my pocket, fingers curling loosely around the cool, familiar shape of my father's pocket watch. Its weight was steady, its chain smooth under my thumb, grounding me in a way no glass of champagne could. Across the room, Marius leaned against the wall, his arms folded, watching with the same quiet patience he'd had the morning we sat on the balcony in the mist. Celine and Howard gleamed under the lights, all polished grace, but I could see the tautness around her eyes, the flicker of nerves she thought no one noticed. A faint, mechanical hum threaded its way into the room, barely perceptible beneath the chatter and the clinking of glasses. It came from beyond the terrace doors, low and distant, like a whisper carried on the ocean breeze. I caught it first, then Marius, his gaze flicked to the glass doors, and back to me, the hint of a knowing glint in his eye. Celine, mid-toast, didn't notice. She was too focused on the audience, on the smooth delivery of the moment. The terrace doors swung open with a measured push, letting in a draft of sea air that carried with it the faint tang of salt and fuel. Lieutenant Rowan stepped in with deliberate precision, his crisp uniform catching the chandelier light like cut steel. His boots clicked against the marble floor, a rhythm so distinct it hushed the conversations without a word. He moved with the ease of a man who'd drilled every step, stopping just a pace away from me. He brought his hand up sharply, palm down, fingers straight. The salute sharp enough to cut through whatever Celine had planned next.
"Commander Rin,"
he said, his voice firm, but carrying no more volume than necessary reporting, "as ordered, sir." The room's temperature shifted in an instant. Conversations stalled, champagne flutes hovered mid-air. A distant laugh trailed off unfinished. The only sounds left were the faint hum of engines outside and the muted click of the crystal chandelier overhead. I met Rowan's eyes and gave a slow, measured nod. Not a smile, not an explanation. The gesture hung in the air, heavier than Celine's toast, or any whispered jab could ever be. A cousin near the back leaned in close to another, his voice barely carrying "Commander." The word floated into the hush, a question wrapped in curiosity, the kind that makes people rethink everything they thought they understood about someone standing quietly in their midst. Celine's smile faltered, just enough for her carefully set facade to crack her fingers, tightening on the stem of her champagne flute, until her knuckles showed white under the soft light. Howard shifted slightly beside her, glancing between Rowan and me, with the sort of calculation that has nothing to do with weddings and everything to do with suddenly reassessing the people in the room. I exhaled through my nose, slow and steady, and patted the watch in my pocket, feeling the steady curve of its case beneath my palm. The chain shifted slightly, its faint rattle drowned out by the hum beyond the terrace. "Just another inspection," I murmured, quiet enough for only myself and maybe Marius to hear. The words slid into the silence like a stone into deep water, vanishing without ripple, leaving the room to sit with the shift it hadn't seen coming. The ballroom had gone still, its echoes dwindling to the faint hum of the chandeliers overhead, and the distant crash of waves beyond the glass. Most of the guests had already retreated to their suites or spilled into the bar downstairs, leaving the grand space hollow as if the air itself were exhaling after the performance of the evening. I stood by a marble column near the window, the stone cool against my shoulder, my gaze fixed on the moonlight flickering across the Atlantic. Each crest of water seemed to catch the light, like the faint gleam of runway markers leading out to some destination I hadn't yet named, but could almost see in the distance. Celine's heels clicked softly as she approached the deliberate pace of someone rehearsing the weight of her words. Howard followed half a step behind his phone, nowhere in sight for once, his expression practiced but subdued. She stopped a few feet from me, the dim sconces casting long shadows across her silk dress. For a moment she didn't speak. I could feel her trying to gauge my face, see if there was a crack she could step through. Finally, her voice broke the quiet, carefully, even. Howard's firm could use a director of engineering. She began glancing briefly at her fiancé. Double your old salary corner office. Consider it. A peace gesture. A way to move forward. I turned my head just slightly enough to let the moonlight catch her face. There was a flicker there behind the carefully arranged calm, a thread of unease, maybe embarrassment that she didn't want seen. Howard stood straighter, his hands clasped lightly in front of him, the kind of posture men use when they're offering a deal, but trying to make it sound like a gift. I didn't answer right away. My hand slipped into my pocket fingers, finding the repaired edge of my father's watch. The metal was cool, the case perfectly smooth, where the crack had been sealed. A silent reminder of how things could be broken and put back together without needing to look as they once did. Outside, a gust of wind carried the faint roar of the surf up the cliffside, a deep rolling sound that filled the quiet more honestly than any of our voices could. Marius's words from the morning surfaced as naturally as the tide itself. Legacy isn't where you work. It's what you leave behind. I had nodded at the time, but now in this hallway heavy with muted chandeliers and cautious offers, the words rooted themselves deeper. Celine extended a glass of champagne toward me, her nails catching the faint light as she said, almost too lightly, "Let's toast to putting old tensions to rest. It's a new chapter, Callan. We're offering you a way back." I took the glass, turning it in my hand, watching the bubbles climb lazily toward the surface. The stem was cool, delicate, but it felt foreign compared to the familiar heft of the watch in my other pocket. I looked at her, then at Howard, their faces a careful blend of sincerity and calculation. Then, gently, I placed the glass back in Celine's hand. "I'm right where I need to be," I said, my voice even quiet enough that it didn't echo in the vast hallway, but clear enough that neither of them could mistake my meaning. I stepped away from the column, the marble releasing its chill from my back, and started down the corridor toward the exit. Behind me, Howard's voice carried in a low murmur, just enough to reach my ears before the sound of the surf overtook it. "He doesn't need us. That's the point." I didn't slow, didn't look back. The moonlight spilling through the windows stretched ahead of me like a pale guide, and I followed it each step away from the column, feeling lighter than the last. The first toll of the church bell rolled across the bay like a slow wave deep, and measured each vibration carried on the crisp spring air. I stood on the porch of my cabin, the planks cool beneath my bare feet, the breeze bringing with it the brine of Narragansett Bay, and the faint musk of the fog lifting off the water. Marius stood beside me, his back straight, despite the cane resting at his side, one hand extended with something small, glinting in the weak morning light. The pocket watch was warm from his palm when it touched mine. Its chain coiled like a silver ribbon across my fingers. The glass face, once spiderwebbed and sharp, now gleamed smooth and whole, the faintest line of repair only visible if you knew where to look. "Your father would have given this to someone who needed it more," Marius said, his voice low, the timbre carrying a weight the breeze couldn't scatter.
"You'll know when to let it go."
He held my gaze for a moment, his eyes steady, not searching but certain. Then he turned his attention out toward the water, the seagulls arcing above the clearing sky like scribbles of white chalk. I rolled the watch in my palm, listening to its soft, rhythmic ticking, steady, unhurried, indifferent to anything but its own measure of time. On the small table beside me, a stack of proposals waited, neatly bound, the top page marked with a simple title, Harbor Light Fund, Draft, Charter. The numbers, signatures, and bullet points inside spoke of structure and logistics, but the reality was simpler. It would be a lifeline, a means to support engineers and technicians whose livelihoods had been stripped away by mergers and mismanagement, people who'd been told they were expendable because efficiency spreadsheets said so. The wind carried another chime of the bell, this one softer as the air shifted. I thumbed the latch on the watch, the click delicate but distinct, and closed it. The weight of it felt different now, less like an anchor, more like a passing torch. I set it gently atop the proposals, the polished surface catching a sliver of sunlight, breaking through the thinning fog. My fingers lingered there, for a breath, a silent pledge carved into the smallest gesture. Marius's cane tapped once against the wood, a quiet punctuation before he said, "Legacies don't live in drawers. They move when we do." His voice held no lecture, just a quiet recognition of the choice already made. I nodded, not looking up, my focus on the stack beneath my hand. In a few hours I'd sign the documents and make the Harbor Light Fund official, but the decision had already rooted itself here on this porch, with the bay yawning wide before us and the gulls crying faintly above. The bell tolled again, sharper this time, like it had been struck with more intent. I pulled the pen from the folder's spine and signed my name across the last page, the ink gliding smooth and final. A gust swept up the bay, ruffling the papers, before I anchored them beneath the watch. The click of the lid as I closed it again felt like a seal, something binding in its simplicity. Then the phone on the railing buzzed, vibrating against the wood. I reached for it, glancing at the message. A private airline confirming my long-term consulting contract, steady work, flexible hours starting Monday. The kind of offer I might have once seen as a victory, but now it felt more like a quiet affirmation that I'd rebuilt enough to choose what came next, rather than take what was handed to me. I slipped the phone into my pocket, next to the pen, and stepped back beside Marius. The wind eased, the sun edged higher, and the repaired watch ticked softly on the stack of papers behind me, no longer just a keepsake, but a signal. The bay lay open ahead, calm and bright, as the final chime of the bell drifted across the water. Smoke from the grill curled upward in lazy gray ribbons, dissolving into the soft glow of a summer evening. The pavilion at the edge of Newport's public beach hummed with the low sound of conversation and the faint notes of a guitar drifting from a portable speaker propped against a cooler. The air carried the mixed scents of salt charcoal and something sweet, probably the peach glaze someone had brought for the ribs. I stood near one of the folding tables, a paper plate balanced in one hand, piled high with cornbread and coleslaw. It felt easy to breathe here, the kind of space where laughter didn't sound rehearsed and the sky seemed to stretch just a little wider than usual. On a glass display near the center of the gathering sat my father's pocket watch, its polished case catching the last fingers of sunlight as they reached across the sand. Beside it, a bronze plaque bore the engraved name Harbor Light Foundation, the letters sharp and clean, a simple emblem for something meant to last longer than any of us standing here. It had been funded by a portion of my consulting income and seeded with donations from a handful of people who understood what it felt like to be blindsided by mergers and pink slips. The watch, once a tether to everything I thought I'd lost, had become a symbol for the people circling this pavilion, quiet proof that being written off didn't have to be the end of the story. Marius sat a little back from the main crowd, his hands resting on the handle of his cane, his eyes following the small clusters of conversation with a quiet satisfaction. Every so often, someone would stop to greet him, and he'd nod a thin smile, softening the lines of his face. I caught his gaze once and saw him give me the smallest nod, the kind a man reserves for moments when words would only dilute what doesn't need saying. Across the table, Celine stood apart from Howard, who was chatting near the grill with a group of local business owners. She held a paper cup instead of crystal, her silk blouse tied back at the sleeves, as if she'd finally decided not to care about the wind off the water. When our eyes met, there was no performance in hers, this time, no glint of competition or teasing. She stepped closer, voice low enough that only I could hear. "Thank you," she said, simple and unembellished. Whatever else she meant by it. Gratitude, maybe. Respect it was enough. I nodded once, not needing more. As the evening wore on, stories started to flow as easily as the iced tea and beer. A former systems analyst talked about taking night classes to pivot into teaching. A retired airframe mechanic described how he'd started a small workshop repairing tools for local marinas. Their voices carried over the gentle wash of waves, a chorus of second chances punctuated by the occasional cheer when someone clinked their plastic cup against another. It wasn't loud or grand, but it was solid, the kind of sound that felt like roots sinking deeper, tying everyone together. The sun sank lower, staining the horizon in bands of amber and rose. I glanced toward the glass case one more time. The watch's hands, steady and certain, caught a final glimmer of light, throwing it back in a flash so faint I almost thought I imagined it. I stepped away from the table plate empty now and wandered closer to the edge of the sand where the waves reached and receded in slow, even breaths. I let my gaze follow the horizon until the colors blurred together, the line between sea and sky fading in the dusk. The music softened behind me as the guitarist shifted to something slower, and the chatter dimmed to a hum as people settled into the rhythm of the evening. I breathed in the mingled scents of smoke and salt one last time, let them settle like an anchor in my chest, and murmured into the quiet, half to myself. Every minute's finally mine. The waves didn't answer, but they didn't need to. The watch would keep ticking. The foundation would keep standing, and the night with all its quiet, unremarkable beauty felt exactly long enough. The last streaks of dusk faded over the pavilion, the cool, salt breeze carrying the faint ticking of my father's watch as it rested safely beneath the foundation's plaque. Standing there, I realized how strange it felt to see something once broken become the symbol of something larger than me. Sometimes the bridges we're forced to leave behind aren't meant to be crossed again. They remind us to build new ones with steadier hands. For anyone facing layoffs, divorce, or a season of loss, know this. There's a way forward, even when all you see is the fog. Has life ever handed you a second chance in disguise? Share your story with us below.